A gang of ruthless bandits storms into a quiet frontier town, terrorizing its people and mocking a shy farm girl who seems too timid to fight back. But Daisy Harper isn't just any farm girl. She's the daughter of a legendary sharpshooter, and the skills her father taught her have been kept hidden until now. When the gang threatens her home and her ailing mother, Daisy's choice is clear. Stand up, fight back, and protect everything she holds dear. Outnumbered and underestimated, Daisy's fight for survival becomes a battle for justice that could spark a revolution against corruption across the land. Before we dive into the story, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe. There's a special surprise waiting for you tomorrow. The sun hung low over the sprawling plains, casting long shadows across the dusty expanse of Daisy Harper's family farm. The fields, once lush and green, now stood dry and brittle, a testament to years of drought and hardship. Daisy wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands calloused from endless hours of work. Her mother, pale and frail, sat on the porch in a rocking chair, knitting quietly while Daisy hauled water from the well. Despite the exhaustion etched into her features, Daisy moved with purpose, her movements steady and precise, even as her mind churned with worry about their future. Above the porch door, a rifle hung on rusted hooks. It was an old piece, the wood polished smooth by time and use. Daisy avoided looking at it, even as she felt its weight in her memories. The rifle had belonged to her father, Iron Hand Harper, a man whose sharpshooting skills had become the stuff of local legend. He taught her how to shoot before he died, and Daisy had inherited his uncanny precision, but she'd sworn never to pick up the weapon again. Her life was simpler now, quieter, or so she hoped it could stay. That hope shattered the moment Logan Crane's gang rode into town. From the porch, Daisy could see the plume of dust rising from the road, followed by the distant sound of hooves. She knew the stories about Crane and his men, thieves and murderers who worked under the thumb of Elias Grayson, the land baron who claimed ownership of nearly every inch of the territory. Their arrival sent a chill through her, but she kept her hands busy, her mind sharp. Minutes later, the gang reached the center of town, their shouts carrying over the quiet streets. Daisy glanced toward the distant general store, where the sound of breaking glass and panicked cries echoed in the air. The townsfolk, already cowed by years of Grayson's control, offered little resistance. It wasn't long before the riders turned their attention toward the Harper farm. Daisy's stomach tightened as Crane and two of his men rode up, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Crane grinned, his teeth yellowed beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Afternoon, Missy," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "I reckon you and your ma owe a little rent money. We've come to collect." "We don't owe anything," Daisy said evenly, her hands clenched at her sides. Crane chuckled, swinging down from his horse. He towered over her, his greasy leather coat smelling of sweat and whiskey. "I think you do. Grayson's been real patiency, but patience runs out. You've got 3 days, or we'll come back and take what we're owed, one way or another." When Daisy didn't flinch, one of Crane's men shoved her, sending her sprawling into the dirt. They laughed as Crane spat on the ground. "Be smart, girl. Don't make this harder than it has to be." As they rode off, Daisy sat in the dust, her face grim. The rifle above the door seemed to glint in the dying light, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The town was eerily quiet after the gang's visit. Daisy walked the dirt road back to the general store, her steps heavy, her mind racing. Broken glass crunched beneath her boots as she passed the shattered front window. Inside, old Mr. Carlyle, the store owner, was sweeping up the mess, his hands trembling. His wife sat behind the counter, her face pale as she clutched a tattered ledger. They barely glanced at Daisy as she entered, their eyes hollow with fear. "You all right?" Daisy asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Mr. Carlyle paused, leaning on his broom, and let out a bitter laugh. "It's nothing new, just another day of paying Grayson's toll." His eyes, red-rimmed and weary, met hers. "They'll bleed us dry, all of us. And if anyone fights back, well, you know what happens." Daisy nodded, her jaw tight. Everyone in town knew the stories. A farmer 3 miles out had resisted just a year ago, refusing to hand over his cattle. The gang returned a week later, torching his barn and leaving him beaten so badly he couldn't walk for months. No one dared to help him rebuild, too afraid of drawing attention to themselves. That memory gnawed at Daisy now, as she bought the bare essentials for her mother: a bag of flour, a sack of beans, and a tin of coffee. Stay safe, Daisy, Mrs. Carlyle said softly as Daisy turned to leave. There was pity in her voice, a quiet acknowledgement of the danger that now loomed over the Harper farm. The walk home was lonelier than usual, the fields stretching out in all directions under a sky darkening with twilight. The weight of what had happened sat heavy on Daisy's shoulders. She thought of her mother, fragile and vulnerable, and of the home they'd built with her father before everything fell apart. For years, Daisy had done everything she could to keep them afloat. Hard work, quiet resilience, and a determination to avoid trouble at all costs. But now, trouble had found her anyway, and it was only a matter of time before Crane's gang came back to make good on their threats. As Daisy approached the farmhouse, her eyes fell on the rifle above the door. She paused on the porch, staring at it for a long moment. Memories flooded back, her father's calm voice steadying her hands as she learned to aim. "It's not about pulling the trigger," he used to say. "It's about knowing when and why." Her mother's voice startled her out of her thoughts. "Daisy, is that you?" "Yes, Mama, it's me," Daisy replied, stepping inside. That night, Daisy lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fear in her mother's voice, the pity in Mrs. Carlyle's eyes, the smug grin on Logan Crane's face, they all played in her mind. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. Trouble might have found her, but she wasn't going to wait for it to destroy her family. Not again. Daisy stood at the well the next morning, the bucket in her hands trembling slightly as she drew it up. The sky was a pale blue, the kind of peaceful backdrop that made the previous day's threats feel like a bad dream. But the soreness in her arms from being shoved into the dirt and the scuff on her dress told her otherwise. Logan Crane's words echoed in her mind, his smug warning as vivid as if he were standing there again. 3 days, that was all they had. When Daisy carried the bucket back to the porch, her mother was waiting. Mrs. Harper looked tired, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes were sharp with worry. "You've been quiet," she said gently. "I can see something's weighing on you." Daisy set the bucket down and hesitated. She had never been one to lie to her mother, but telling the full truth now would only make things worse. "The gang stopped by yesterday," she said, trying to sound casual. "They're just looking to make trouble, same as always. Nothing new." Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Daisy, don't try to protect me by hiding the truth." "What did they say?" "They said we owe them rent," Daisy admitted, her voice low. "And if we don't pay, they'll come back and take it out of the farm." Mrs. Harper closed her eyes, her frail hands gripping the arms of her chair. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch as Daisy shifted uncomfortably. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't fight them, Daisy. People who stand up to them don't survive." Daisy didn't answer. Instead, she stared out at the fields, their dry stalks swaying in the breeze. She thought of the townsfolk, beaten down and afraid, and how, every time the gang came through, it was the same: compliance, silence, survival. But that wasn't living, it was hiding. As the sun dipped lower, Daisy found herself drawn to the rifle above the door. Her mother had insisted it stay there, untouched after her father passed. "This family's had enough of guns," her mother had said. But Daisy remembered what it felt like to hold it, how natural it was, like an extension of herself. That night, Daisy lit a lantern and slipped out to the barn. The rifle felt heavier than she remembered as she pulled it down from its resting place. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, the memories of her father's lessons rushing back to her. "The first rule," he'd told her, "is to never point it unless you're ready to follow through." She set up a line of empty cans along a fence post and took a deep breath. Her first shot rang out, shattering the silence of the night, and the can flew off the post, Daisy lowered the rifle, her hands steady and her jaw set. Trouble was coming, but she wasn't going to wait for it to crush them. She'd be ready. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over the Harper farm. Daisy stood behind a stack of hay bales she'd arranged as cover, the rifle cradled in her arms. Her breaths came slow and measured as she scanned the horizon. She had been practicing all night, her muscles aching from the effort, but she didn't care. If Crane and his gang came back, they would find out just how far from helpless she really was. The morning passed in uneasy silence. Daisy worked on the farm as usual, but her senses were heightened, every sound and movement drawing her attention. When the faint rumble of hooves reached her ears around midday, her heart quickened. She grabbed the rifle from its hiding spot and climbed to the loft of the barn, peering out through a crack in the wooden slats. Crane and 4 of his men rode into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Crane dismounted first, his spurs jingling as he strode toward the house. Daisy tightened her grip on the rifle and steadied her breathing. "Afternoon, ladies," Crane called, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're here to collect." "Mrs." Harper stepped out onto the porch, her frail frame dwarfed by Crane's looming presence. "We don't have what you're asking for," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Crane smirked. "That's not my problem. I told you we'd be back, and here we are, so you either pay up or we'll start taking things." He motioned to one of his men, who began walking toward the barn. Daisy's blood boiled. She took aim, her sights trained on the man's boot. A shot rang out, the sharp crack echoing across the yard, and the man stumbled back, clutching his foot. Crane and the others froze, their eyes darting toward the barn. "What the—" Crane started, but Daisy fired again, this time grazing the brim of his hat and sending it spinning into the dirt. "Next one won't miss," Daisy called, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Crane's eyes narrowed as he searched for her, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Who's got the guts to play hero?" "Just a farm girl," Daisy said, stepping into view with the rifle raised. "But a farm girl with a good aim." The men hesitated, glancing at one another, unsure whether to charge or retreat. Crane's face darkened, his bravado wavering. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "No, you made the mistake when you came here thinking we'd roll over." Daisy shot back. She cocked the rifle, her stance firm. "Now get off our land." Crane clenched his jaw, but he motioned for his men to fall back. "This isn't over," he snarled before mounting his horse. "You'll regret this." As the gang rode away, Daisy lowered the rifle, her heart pounding. She had won this round, but she knew it was only the beginning. They'd be back, and next time, they'd come ready. Word spread quickly after the incident at the Harper farm. By the next morning, Daisy couldn't take 2 steps in town without feeling the weight of curious eyes on her. People whispered. Behind her back, some in awe, others in fear. She caught snippets of conversation as she passed the general store. "Did you hear? She ran Crane off her land. No way a farm girl could stand up to him. He'll come back, and worse." Daisy ignored the murmurs and kept her head high. She hadn't gone into town to win anyone's approval. She needed supplies and information. The gang would return, she was sure of it, and she needed to be ready. Inside the store, Mr. Carlyle gave her a long, appraising look before speaking. "I heard what you did," he said, his voice low and cautious. "They didn't give me much choice," Daisy replied, setting a sack of potatoes on the counter. "Most folks would have just paid up," Carlyle said, glancing around the empty store. "But you've got fire in you, just like your old man." Daisy stiffened at the mention of her father, but didn't respond. Carlyle leaned in, lowering his voice. "If you're serious about standing up to them, you're gonna need help. You can't fight them alone." Daisy considered his words as she walked back to the farm. He was right. Crane and his gang were too many, and when they came back they wouldn't be caught off guard. She needed a plan, and she needed people who were willing to fight. That evening, Daisy visited the Johnsons, a family whose farm had been ravaged by the gang months earlier. Mr. Johnson had barely recovered from the beating he'd taken while defending his livestock. His son Luke was a strong, capable young man, but fear had kept them both from acting. "You've seen what they're capable of," Daisy said, standing in their kitchen, her voice firm. "But I've shown they're not invincible. If we work together, we can protect what's ours." Luke's eyes lit up with determination, but his father hesitated. "It's too dangerous," Mr. Johnson said, shaking his head. "We've already lost too much." "Then how much more are you willing to lose?" Daisy asked, her gaze unwavering. "Because they won't stop, not until they've taken everything." By the time Daisy left, Luke had agreed to help. Over the next few days, she approached others, families who had suffered under the gang's rule, shopkeepers who were tired of handing over their hard-earned money, and laborers who had been beaten down but not broken. Her small resistance began taking shape. They met in secret, working late into the night to plan their moves. Daisy taught them what she could: how to shoot, how to set traps, and how to stay calm under pressure. Together, they sabotaged the gang's supply routes, cutting off their stolen goods and redistributing them to the townsfolk. Each victory was small, but meaningful. For the first time in years, people began to believe that fighting back was possible. But Daisy knew their successes wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Crane and Grayson would retaliate, and when they did, the stakes would be higher than ever. The ambush was Daisy's boldest move yet. It had taken weeks of planning, long nights of strategizing with her small band of allies, and every ounce of caution they could muster. The gang's supply route had become predictable, their arrogance making them sloppy. Every few days, a wagon loaded with stolen goods traveled along the old dirt road just outside town. Daisy knew it was their chance to strike a significant blow. The plan was simple: cut off the wagon, disable the horses, and take the supplies. But executing it required precision and courage. Daisy, Luke, and two other men from the resistance, Sam, a former blacksmith, and Jeremiah, an aging farmer with a steady hand, hid in the underbrush along the road, their weapons at the ready. The wagon appeared just as expected, the creak of its wheels announcing its arrival long before it came into view. Two of Crane's men rode alongside it, lazily chatting, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They weren't expecting trouble, and Daisy intended to keep it that way until it was too late. She raised her hand, signaling the others to hold their positions. The wagon rolled closer, the horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. Daisy's heart pounded as she took aim. Timing was everything. The first shot rang out, shattering the quiet. One of the gang members fell from his horse with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The second man barely had time to react before Luke fired, his shot grazing the horse's flank and sending it rearing. The wagon lurched to a stop as Sam and Jeremiah rushed forward, weapons drawn. "Don't even think about it," Sam shouted, leveling his rifle at the driver, who froze with his hands raised. Daisy emerged from the brush, her rifle steady as she approached. "Unload it," she ordered, her voice cold and calm. The driver hesitated, his eyes darting between Daisy and the wounded man groaning on the ground. "You've got no idea what you're messing with," he said, his voice trembling. "Maybe not," Daisy replied, "but I know enough to shoot straighter than you." Under their watchful eyes, the driver and the uninjured gang member unloaded the wagon. It was a treasure trove of stolen goods, food, medicine, tools, supplies that could keep the town going for months. Daisy and her group worked quickly, loading everything onto their own wagon. They were gone before reinforcements could arrive, their tracks carefully covered. That night, as the supplies were distributed among the townsfolk, Daisy felt a flicker of hope. The people were beginning to see that the gang wasn't invincible, that fighting back wasn't just a fool's errand, but she knew the cost of their victory would soon come due. Word of the ambush would reach Crane and, worse, Grayson, the land. Baron would never let such a bold defiance go unanswered. Daisy steeled herself for what she knew was coming. Their fight had only just begun, and the storm was about to break. The attack came at dawn. Daisy was jolted awake by the sound of galloping hooves and the crackle of flames. She shot out of bed, her heart pounding, and rushed to the window. The barn was already engulfed, fire licking at the sky in fierce orange waves. Shadows moved against the blaze, figures on horseback, shouting and laughing as they circled the farmhouse. "Daisy!" Her mother's voice was panicked, trembling from the next room. "I'm here, Mama." Daisy grabbed her rifle and sprinted to her mother's side. She helped the older woman out of bed, wrapping a blanket around her frail shoulders. The flames from the barn cast eerie shadows on the walls, and Daisy knew they didn't have much time. "They're here to burn us out," Daisy said, her voice tight with anger. She helped her mother toward the back door, keeping her movements quick. "But careful. Stay low and head for the creek. I'll keep them busy." "Daisy, no." "Mama, please." Daisy cut her off, gripping her mother's shoulders. "You have to trust me. Go now." Mrs. Harper hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but she nodded. Daisy watched her disappear into the early morning mist before turning back toward the front of the house. From the porch, Daisy could see Crane sitting tall on his horse, a cruel grin spread across his face. "Come on out, little sharpshooter," he called, his voice carrying over the roar of the flames. "We've got a message for you." Daisy raised her rifle and fired, the shot splintering the wooden post near Crane's head. His grin vanished, replaced by a scowl as he barked orders to his men. Bullets began to pepper the farmhouse, shattering windows and thudding into the walls. Daisy crouched behind the doorframe, her heart racing. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, and fired again, this time hitting one of the gang's horses. The animal reared, throwing its rider to the ground. Another shot followed, grazing a second man's arm, but there were too many of them. For every shot Daisy fired, another two came in return. She could hear their boots hitting the ground now, their voices growing louder as they closed in. Smoke from the barn began to seep into the house, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. A loud crash echoed through the air as one of the gang members broke down the front door. Daisy spun, firing instinctively, and the man dropped with a cry. She retreated up the stairs, every step a desperate effort to buy time. By the time the gang retreated, the farm was in ruins. The barn was nothing but smoldering ash, and the house had been ransacked. Daisy sat on the ground near the creek, her mother clutching her arm as they watched the smoke rise into the sky. "It's all gone," Daisy whispered, her voice hollow. Mrs. Harper squeezed her hand. "Not everything." But as Daisy stared at the destruction, the weight of her failure settled over her like a shroud. She had underestimated them, and now she wasn't sure if they could recover. Daisy sat on the edge of the creek, her knees pulled to her chest as the last wisps of smoke rose into the sky. The air smelled of ash and burnt wood, and the quiet around her felt oppressive, broken only by the soft babble of the water. Her mother dozed fitfully under a nearby tree, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Daisy had insisted she rest, though she hadn't been able to find rest herself. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of regret and guilt. The barn, the house, the farm, everything her family had worked for was gone. She had fought to protect it, but it hadn't been enough. Worse, the townsfolk who had dared to join her would see this as a warning. The resistance she'd begun to build could crumble under the weight of fear. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as her father's voice echoed in her memory. "It's not about pulling the trigger, Daisy. It's about knowing when and why." The words felt hollow now. When had she ever felt ready for this fight? Why had she thought she could make a difference? Her eyes drifted to the saddlebag lying nearby, salvaged in the chaos. She had stuffed it with supplies before fleeing the house, and now its contents spilled out, a tattered blanket, a handful of bullets, and a worn leather journal. She froze when she saw it, her breath catching in her throat. Her father's journal. Daisy picked it up gingerly, running her fingers over the cracked cover. She had avoided reading it for years, afraid of the memories it might dredge up, but now, with everything else lost, it felt like the only piece of him she had left. Flipping it open, she found his familiar handwriting, strong and deliberate. The entries were filled with notes on shooting techniques, survival tips, and reflections on justice and courage. One passage caught her eye, written in bold strokes that seemed to leap off the page. "You can't wait for someone else to fight your battles. Stand tall, even when the odds are against you. Sometimes one person's courage is all it takes to..." Light the fire in others. The words hit Daisy like a spark, igniting something deep inside her. Her father had lived by these principles, and she had seen glimpses of that fire in the people who had joined her. They had believed in her, even if only for a moment. If she gave up now, what would that leave them with? Daisy closed the journal and stood, her legs shaky, but her resolve firm. She walked over to her mother, gently shaking her awake. "Mama," Daisy said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "We're not finished yet. I don't care how much they've taken. We're going to fight back, not just for us, but for everyone they've hurt." Mrs. Harper looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with both fear and pride. "Are you sure?" Daisy nodded, gripping the journal tightly. "I've never been more sure." With renewed purpose, Daisy began planning her next move. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about justice, and she wasn't going to back down. Daisy stood in the center of the old barn behind the Johnsons' farm, the one place in town still safe for secret gatherings. The air was thick with tension as she looked around at the faces of those who had joined her. A dozen townsfolk, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. Luke Johnson stood by her side, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Sam and Jeremiah were in the back, whispering to each other, their rifles slung over their shoulders. She cleared her throat, silencing the room. "I know what you're all thinking," Daisy began, her voice steady but firm. "You're wondering if this is worth it, if standing up to them is worth losing everything we've got left." Her gaze swept over the group, lingering on each person for a moment. She saw the same doubt in their eyes that had plagued her after the attack on her farm. But she also saw something else, a spark, faint but alive, waiting to be fanned into flame. "My family's farm is gone," Daisy continued, her voice rising. "They burned it to the ground because I stood up to them. But I'll tell you what I learned when I watched it burn. They're scared of us, scared of what we can do when we stop letting them push us around." Luke stepped forward, his voice loud and sure. "They've taken from all of us, our crops, our livestock, our hard-earned money. They think we'll just keep taking it, but I'm done letting them walk all over us." Jeremiah nodded, his weathered face grim. "We've already got nothing left to lose. Might as well give them hell while we're at it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Daisy seized the moment, raising her voice to match the rising energy. "We're not just fighting for our farms or our families anymore," she said. "We're fighting for something bigger. If we stand together, we can take back more than what they stole. We can take back our freedom, but I need all of you to commit to this, not just halfway, not just when it's easy. All in." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over them. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. Sam raised his first, followed by Jeremiah. Soon, everyone had their hand in the air, their faces set with determination. "Good," Daisy said, a fierce pride swelling in her chest. "Here's the plan." She laid out the details of the trap they would set for Grayson and Crane. Using an abandoned mine just outside of town, they would lure the gang into a bottleneck, cutting off their escape routes. Traps would be set along the trail, and sharpshooters would be stationed at strategic points. The goal was to end the gang's reign of terror once and for all. As the group dispersed to prepare, Daisy stood alone for a moment, staring at the old wooden beams above her. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for the town. They were finally ready to fight back, and this time they wouldn't be doing it alone. The abandoned mine loomed in the distance, its dark mouth gaping like a warning. The path leading to it was narrow and rocky, flanked by steep hills and thick brush. Daisy crouched behind an outcrop, her rifle resting against the rock, her breath steady despite the tension in the air. Beside her, Luke checked his weapon, his face grim but focused. They had worked tirelessly over the past few days, setting traps and securing the area. Daisy's group had grown as word of the plan spread. More townsfolk had joined, emboldened by the chance to take back their lives. The mine was the perfect battleground. Its narrow entrance meant the gang couldn't overwhelm them with numbers, and the high ground gave the resistance a clear advantage. The sound of approaching hooves broke the silence. Daisy adjusted her position, peering down the trail. The gang was coming just as they'd expected. Logan Crane rode at the front, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his rifle resting across his saddle. Behind him was a dozen men, heavily armed, and looking eager for blood. "Everyone in position," Daisy whispered into the small hand mirror she used to signal. From across the hillside, a series of flashes answered her, a signal from Jeremiah, Sam, and the others stationed around the mine. The gang drew closer, their laughter and crude jokes carrying on the wind. Daisy's jaw tightened as Crane called, out his voice mocking, "Daisy Harper, I know you're out here hiding like a scared little rabbit. Why don't you come out and play?" Daisy ignored the taunt, waiting for the right moment. The first trap sprung as the gang passed a concealed wire strung across the trail. It pulled taut, snapping one of the lead horse's legs out from under it. The animal went down with a scream, and chaos erupted. Men shouted as another trap triggered, a small explosion that sent rocks cascading down the hillside. The gang scattered, some trying to retreat, others pushing forward. Crane barked orders, trying to regain control, but the resistance was already in motion. Daisy's first shot rang out, precise and deadly. One of the gang members dropped from his horse, clutching his chest. Luke followed with a shot that hit another rider in the shoulder, sending him tumbling to the ground. "Hold your positions," Daisy yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. From their elevated spots, the resistance fighters picked off the gang one by one. The traps funneled them into the narrowest part of the trail, where they were exposed to the sharpshooters above. Crane, realizing the trap too late, turned his horse, trying to flee. Daisy lined up her shot, her breathing steady. The rifle cracked and Crane's hat flew from his head. As the bullet grazed his temple, he swayed but managed to stay upright, his face contorted with rage. "Push forward!" he roared to his remaining men. But his voice was drowned out by another round of gunfire. By the time the dust settled, the gang was in tatters. Only a few had escaped, and Crane was forced to retreat, his pride and his army shattered. Daisy lowered her rifle, her heart pounding. The first battle was won, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning. The smoke cleared and the battlefield fell silent. Bodies and broken weapons lay scattered along the narrow trail leading to the mine. Daisy stood among the rocks, her rifle still in her hands, her breaths heavy and uneven. The rush of adrenaline ebbed, leaving her limbs shaky but her mind sharp. She scanned the trail below, searching for any sign of Logan Crane. Luke climbed up to join her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Most of them are down or scattered," he said, his voice low. But Crane got away. He and a few of his men headed back toward the ridge. Daisy's jaw clenched. He won't go far, not without finishing what he started. Gathering her remaining fighters, Daisy quickly devised a plan. They would cut Crane off before he could regroup with Grayson's forces. Jeremiah and Sam stayed behind to tend to the wounded and secure the mine, while Daisy, Luke, and a small group of sharpshooters pursued Crane. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, the air thinner and colder. They found Crane and his men near a rocky outcrop, their horses tied up and their weapons drawn. Crane was pacing, barking orders at his men to hold their ground. Daisy motioned for her group to fan out, each taking cover among the boulders. She crept closer, her rifle raised, until she was within earshot of Crane's furious rant. "We're not running from some farm girl," he spat, his voice venomous. "She's just a lucky shot, nothing more. We'll regroup and finish this." Daisy stepped out from behind the rocks, her rifle aimed directly at him. "You're wrong, Crane. This isn't luck, it's justice." Crane froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. The men around him hesitated, their confidence shaken. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "Grayson will send more. Men, you can't stop him." "I don't need to stop him," Daisy replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just need to make sure you don't hurt anyone else." Crane's hand hovered near his pistol, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Daisy didn't flinch, her aim steady. When Crane moved, it was too slow. Her shot rang out, striking his hand and sending the pistol clattering to the ground. He cried out in pain, clutching his bleeding hand. His men, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. "Enough!" Daisy shouted, her voice echoing off the rocks. "This ends here. You're done terrorizing this town and you're done running. Now move!" The men were rounded up and disarmed, their faces pale and defeated. Crane, his bravado shattered, glared at Daisy but didn't dare speak. By the time they returned to the mine, the sun was beginning to set. The prisoners were secured, and Daisy stood tall as the townsfolk gathered around her. She had delivered a victory, one that sent a clear message to Grayson. The people weren't afraid anymore. The morning air was crisp and clear, the kind that carried a sense of renewal. Daisy stood at the edge of the Harper farm, what remained of it, surveying the land. The barn was gone, reduced to ashes, and the house was little more than charred wood and blackened memories. Yet, despite the destruction, there was a strange sense of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The townsfolk had gathered, just as they promised. Men with hammers and saws, women with baskets of food, and children carrying tools too large for their hands, filled the space where silence and despair had once ruled. They worked together, their voices filled with determination as they cleared debris and began the long process of rebuilding. Daisy set down her rifle, leaning it against the stump of an old tree. For once, it didn't feel like an extension of her arm. Instead, it felt like a tool she could set aside, knowing others were ready to share the burden. Luke approached, carrying a stack of lumber on his shoulder. "Looks like a real start," he said with a grin, setting the wood down beside her. "It is," Daisy replied, her voice quiet but steady. "It's more than I thought we'd have a few weeks ago." "You gave us this?" Luke said, his tone serious now. "You showed us we didn't have to live in fear anymore." Daisy met his eyes, unsure how to respond. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, stretched thin, and burdened by the weight of everything they'd lost. But when she looked out at the people working together, she realized Luke was right. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was theirs. A familiar voice called out, and Daisy turned to see Mrs. Carlyle holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "Daisy," she said, walking briskly toward her. "I thought you might need this." "You're still too thin, dear." Daisy couldn't help but smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Carlyle. I appreciate it." The older woman nodded, her expression softening. "Don't you go forgetting to take care of yourself. We all need you, and not just for that rifle of yours." As Mrs. Carlyle walked away, Daisy let her gaze wander over the bustling scene. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Contentment. It wasn't over. Grayson was still out there, and his reach was long, but the people of the town had found their strength. They were no longer willing to be victims. Daisy picked up a hammer and joined in the work, helping to rebuild the barn. Every nail driven into the wood felt like a step forward, a promise that they would keep fighting no matter what came next. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Daisy wiped the sweat from her brow and looked out at the horizon. The fight had cost her dearly, but it had also given her something she hadn't realized she was missing: a purpose. Whatever tomorrow brought, Daisy Harper was ready.